Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy, and it's not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Arielle Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is a clinical psychologist, trauma expert, and author whose work has redefined what it means to heal. She has spent decades exploring the deep connection between the mind and body, proving that trauma isn't just something we think about, it's something we carry, something that lives in our nervous system, shaping how we see the world, how we trust, how we love, and how we survive. Through her groundbreaking work in somatic psychology, EMDR, polyvagal theory, and post-traumatic growth, Dr. Schwartz has shown that healing is more than just talking about the past. It's about reclaiming the body, restoring safety, and finding our way back to ourselves. She's helped countless people move beyond survival mode, teaching them that trauma may have shaped them, but it does not have to define them. Dr. Schwartz isn't just about resilience. Dr. Schwartz isn't just studying resilience. She's proving that it's possible. And that no matter what we've been through, no matter how long the body has held on to the past, healing is always within reach. So, Dr. Schwartz, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me. And you reworked my bio in a way that feels so meaningful to me to receive. So thank you. Thank you
welcome.
for bringing your own words and your own sense of reverence and honoring of the work that it's taken to get here into how you just introduced me. That meant a lot.
That means a lot to me too. So I'm glad you were able to receive that and that it meant something to you. Also, I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
Yeah, sure. I feel like there's a lot of ways in which I can answer that question, and maybe the top of heart or top of mind response in this particular moment is that it's been important for me to be in the process of growth and change. It feels like what I came into the world to do. And we were talking a little bit before we kind of pressed record on this little back channel conversation about being a cycle breaker. And I know that's true for you and certainly true in my DNA and who I am as well. And coming in as a very sensitive child, coming in as someone who felt everything that was going on within my own family system. And I had two households that I've grown up in because my parents were divorced when I was very young. Starting at the age of 3 or so, I was going back and forth. And I had one household where the kind of unique sensitivities of me were very well understood. And I had another household where they really weren't. And I felt increasingly othered and unsafe and lack of a sense of belonging and insecure and anxiety and all of these symptoms that built up as physical distress and physiological imbalance that led to a lot of chronic illness and distress within me. And gratefully, I also had a lot of early exposure to yoga and somatics, starting at the age of 7 with yoga. And then where I went to college, there was a lot of emphasis on embodiment. And I had an introduction to body mind centering when I was about 20 years old that truly changed my life. And I could feel that both of those channels through, well, maybe 3 channels. One would be yoga, one was embodied practice, and the third was nature. And that in all of those spaces, I felt like I could come home to myself and be more calm inside and feel deeply connected to something that felt more organized within me. And then I just wanted to understand everything that I could about why embodiment was beneficial, why nature is beneficial, why yoga really helps. And pretty much all of that took me in the direction of studying our nervous system.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that you use the word organized, because
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think that's typically something that we think about when it comes to our internal world, especially if we've had a trauma history, or because we might think about organizing the cabinets, or organizing your files and paperwork and things of that nature. But the fact that you use that as it applies to yourself internally, I like that a lot.
Yeah. And it's kind of a funny thing, because there are times in which we need to kind of empty everything out of the cabinet in order to reorganize it, or the closet, or whatever we're organizing. And I feel like that's kind of a bit of what we do with the psyche. Is like there's ways in which we actually have to empty ourselves out and take a look at what it is that we've kind of cluttered inside and are carrying around with us. And therapy is a great space that we do that. And, or journaling, or ways in which we can move out of us. Poetry, art, painting, dance, something that lets us take a look at what it is that we're carrying, so that we can better understand it and put it back inside that which we choose to keep. Some of it we discard, but that which we choose to keep, that we can then kind of hold it more preciously and more mindfully inside.
Thank you for that. And before we go any further, I just want to say how grateful I am to share this space with you, because there's been so much noise around trauma and healing these days, but very few people speak about it from the place that you do and the way you talk about healing. It's clear that it's not just a profession, it's a calling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask, when you reflect on where that calling began, where does your memory take you?
Mm. The first place that my heart takes me is to my mother,
Mm.
and to her commitment. I think of her as maybe the one that allowed me to really be who I am and do what I do. And her commitment to her own healing modeled for me something profound. Continues to. She's still living. I'm sure she'll listen to this. She listens to everything I do, which I'm deeply grateful for. And, she's now, although I shouldn't say that. She won't want me to say that. Take that out.
I'll take it out.
she inspires me so much, because she has been in her own healing journey. She's done her own therapy. I grew up in a family, in that of my two households, that household where we talked about feelings at the dinner table. And I know, can you imagine? Like, we had a feelings check-in, and it was normal to be able to do self-inquiry and to look inside. And so that inspired a lot of what's possible when we feel safe enough to go inside and be with what that interior self is holding for us, which is often so vulnerable, right? And we know that some people don't know how to do that, and some people reject us for doing that. But she didn't. She really modeled that it's important to do that.
Thank you for sharing that. When you look back now about your early life, and I guess your multiple family systems that you had, what do you recognize and understand now that you didn't know then, and how has that impacted you?
Mm. I think that there's a few pieces. One is that I didn't have words back then for things like trauma, dissociation, things that would have helped me have compassion for myself. I didn't even have terms that said, this is what the nervous system does when when you don't feel safe. Right. And so my body was doing all of these things, and my physiology and my nervous system was protecting me, was doing the best that it possibly could when I was sitting at the dinner table and feeling like I was looking at the world from, several, like 15 feet behind myself, and feeling completely frozen. And I had no voice, and I was completely flooded inside, and I couldn't think because my mind would shut off. And I repeatedly experienced that, literally 3 days a week for 15 years, because I would go back and forth between two households, and one household where I would repeatedly dissociate and freeze. And then it manifested as other somatic symptoms where, because I couldn't feel my body, I couldn't feel when I needed to go to the bathroom. And I would have accidents, right? And those were so shameful and so humiliating. But because I didn't know then that that was my body signaling to me, hey, honey, you don't feel safe, and we're going to do something to try and protect you, that I internalized the states of shame and humiliation and developed narratives that matched that experience of there's something wrong with me. I'm the bad child. I have to somehow continue to feel like I have to make amends or take care of them in order to not be continually perceived as the one where there's something wrong with, the one who there's something wrong with. And so now when I essentially can time travel in my mind, and I can go back in time and I can turn towards that young me and I can say, it wasn't your fault. You weren't doing anything wrong. Your body was so smart. You were so smart. I literally thought that I was stupid. I had just internalized because I couldn't think that I was stupid. Right? Like that's that. And that's why I write about complex PTSD.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. I believe that your story and the way you tell it can give a voice to the voiceless and language to those who don't have words. And childhood is so crucial in our development. And if we have these disruptions, where we don't know how to listen to our body or to hear the signals that our nervous system is giving us, we get lost.
That's right.
And if we don't know how to get back to where we were supposed to be, we can live a life of just complete, what's the word? I guess exile from who we really are.
That's right.
And that could be terrible and terrifying. And, we have the shame, we have the self-worth issues. There's so many things that we're struggling with and we don't understand why. And so to have someone who can step in and say, hey, listen, like, I understand what you went through. I was there as well. Let me help you. That's invaluable. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it goes back to the question you asked a moment ago, right? Of like, when did that, I don't know if you want to call it kind of like mission or like purpose, life purpose come through of like, I'm here to in some way help free myself and free others in the process. But I would say that like, that's part of that response too of, kind of feeling at some point along the way that I not only wasn't stupid, but had a gift with words and the capacity to put things that might feel really complex or disorganized, if we go back to that word, and I could organize it for myself through writing. And then realize that those same words, because it, for me, started as a blog back in, when we were writing blogs back in 2012. And I just started putting words into, out into the world and receiving that feedback of, thank you for writing this. This was written for me. Well, it was written for me, but I'm so glad it was written for you too.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful when people can feel themselves in our words.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question I want to ask is about families. Because in every family, there are stories that are told over and over again. And then there are the stories that no one talks about. Were there any unspoken things in your family, things that were felt but never said?
Yeah. Maybe one of the biggest moments that a felt experience came forth, and it's not that it wasn't said, but my body had a much more a much deeper understanding of the impact of the story than I think the words could have ever captured. And this was when I became pregnant with my daughter, my first child. And I struggled so much in that pregnancy, so much so that I had hyperemesis. I was throwing up and throwing up and throwing up. And I lost some 25 pounds when you're supposed to be putting on weight in pregnancy. I struggled with integrating that experience of myself. And every time, and thankfully I was in therapy at the time, and every time I went to see my therapist to work on the feeling that was coming up in me, there was some quality of this deep void. Like I couldn't find the place to settle or to attach within myself and to this being that was growing inside of me, who's my beautiful daughter, who gratefully I'm happy to say that we are so healthfully attached at this, at this juncture in our lives. But at that earliest juncture, I struggled so much. And as I would go in and allow my body to tell the story, it was so much about going back generationally to the place in which my mother gave me secure attachment in some really significant ways, but she didn't get that from her mother. And in fact, she was rejected. Her mother told her she didn't want her as a child, as she didn't want that pregnancy. She tried to end the pregnancy. I mean, those are significant legacy. It's like you've, all of a sudden just taken a field and you've, kind of like given this huge warble in the field. And I felt that warble, right? Like there was something that was a dissonance in me, even though I had attachment, there was a place in my system that didn't know that. And I had I will call it like the sacred opportunity, even though it was extremely challenging, to find the place in me that needed to grieve what had happened between my grandmother and my mother. And there's kind of a layer of this generational narrative that goes back. My daughter's 22 now. So, we can go back, many years in organizing around that narrative. But in 2020, when Russia was going into Ukraine, I saw an image. So we're going to jump ahead, right? Like jump ahead in the timeline. I saw an image on the news and social media of a convoy of tanks heading into Kyiv. And I went into meditation right after seeing the news. And sometimes you don't want to look at your phone right before you sit down for meditation because that's just right front and center. And I keep seeing this image of this convoy of tanks and I'm weeping, like so deep, soul level. Some part of me is having a felt experience of this. And I hear the words motherland. I come out of meditation and I hear the words, go look at your family tree. So I come downstairs. Thankfully, I have a distant second cousin who had created our family tree and on that side of my family. And I pull it out and I start looking and kind of comparing some dates and doing some deeper dive search of like, why did my great grandmother leave Kyiv, which is where my family was from? Was born in Kyiv, the same city that I've just seen on the news with these tanks heading toward it. And what was happening in our family at that time? So my great grandmother was pregnant with my grandmother when she fled. When Jews are being placed in pogroms and when she leaves her mother, her family behind, her motherland to survive, right? So on the one hand, endowing me with profound ancestral resilience, right? A survivor. On the other hand, a massive in pregnancy flight, trauma, shock. grief
Mhm.
that my body knew. And it's so interesting to tell this story in this way to you right now, because even right now, as I'm telling the story, I can feel like the connections, because I really didn't link the pregnancy part and what my body knew beyond going all the way back. But there was something now as I'm sharing this where I see it, right? Like it's almost like as soon as you see it, you can't unsee it.
Mhm.
That's what my body knew, even though I literally did not know that story until 2020. Right.
The wisdom that is in our bodies and the trauma that can be passed down also until someone has a space to feel it can be a gift and a burden all in one, because you have the chance now to make sure that it doesn't go past you, but you also don't understand why it's happening.
Right.
Right. So how difficult was it for you, I guess, to experience it at the time and then later put the pieces of the puzzle together to understand what was happening? And were you able to, I guess, grieve it at different stages?
Yeah. So many stages and
Mhm.
so many intertwining stories. And I think that's where it gets really complex and complex and complicated to understand, because there were many layers to what was unwinding in my soma and my psyche. And I often describe the process of healing from trauma as a weaving journey. And sometimes we have this very tangled, kind of ball of many threads that are all tangled together. All of those different colors, all of the different shades of our life experiences and our generational experiences, all bound together. And as we start to heal one of those layers of ourselves or one of those stories, it's like we've untangled one thread, and we can see much more clearly, like, oh, there was the thread of my mother not being wanted by her mother. There was the thread of my great grandmother being pregnant with that same grandmother who had to flee from her mother and under duress is during the pregnancy. And I can explain more about the timeline of all of this at a later point, but I think it's just, and then there was other threads that were woven in. My brother-in-law was killed a year before I became pregnant with my daughter. That thread was untangling because he was a special operations pilot after 9/11 and was killed when his helicopter went down, and in an Al Qaeda mission. And our whole family was in acute grief, and I become pregnant with her, and her due date falls on the 1-year anniversary of his death. Right. So there's all of these threads that are kind of unwinding from this entangled ball of yarn. And to some degree, I think my life's work will be continuing to pull out some of those threads. But once we have the clean and clear threads, we don't discard them. We're not going to get rid of them. What we then do is we get to weave a new cloth that feels coherent, a new cloth that helps us make sense of the past and who we are. And that to me is that journey from trauma, post-traumatic stress, or even, generational trauma toward post-traumatic growth.
So let me ask you this. Let's say someone had a really, really rough pregnancy and they felt completely disconnected from their child. After the child was born, they had what's the term?
Postpartum depression.
Yes, postpartum depression. Thank you. And they can't understand why they can't connect with their child. They wanted the child, they love the child, but there's this disconnect. Can that be something that they're carrying that isn't theirs?
It could be.
Hmm.
And I'm never going to come in and interpret somebody else's symptom or story.
Sure.
And it's always worth holding with what we'll call open inquiry of like, let's just be curious about that. What feels familiar? How does that resonate? This literally just came up in a consult that I was leading this week, and one of the therapists had, kind of brought forth, but I don't know if I'm carrying generational trauma. Like, how do I know if I feel that? And I said that here's what's tricky about it, because sometimes we don't even have the stories or the narratives. We have no kind of mental hook, but your body is basically the place to check in about that, because your body will let you know what you're carrying. And so as we turn towards any symptom, whether that's postpartum depression or struggling, attaching and connecting to our child, or any symptom that we might have, anxiety, depression, somatic chronic pain, go toward it with open inquiry. And you can even ask your body to respond, like, might this be something that I'm carrying that I inherited, right? And notice what your body says in response. It's almost like you don't need one of those, like one of those balls that you would turn in, like, maybe, yes, for sure. Like what was it?
The
The
eight
eight ball,
balls. Yeah.
right? Right? Just magic eight ball. Did you grow up with one of those? I did. Right? We don't need one of those. Your body is your magic eight ball.
Mm,
And
I
it's
love
going to
that.
let you know maybe, or yes, definitely, for sure.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that the way you did. Um, if anyone's listening and hearing about reclaiming parts of themselves that may have been abandoned, or carrying something that may not belong to them, what would you say is the first piece of learning how to reconnect with themselves?
Some of what we're speaking about is how other people help us reconnect to ourselves. And I think that's a really important part of this whole story is having another person who's willing to offer their care and curiosity and tenderness to sit with you in the unknown.
Mm.
And I think that I know that there is no way that I could have healed the way that I have been able to do so without the supportive people and spaces that have allowed for that. And that doesn't always mean that you're going towards a one-on-one therapy, because A, that's expensive, and B, it's hard to find sometimes the right therapist and all of that. I think even sometimes leaning into a conversation like this, not just as an external observer of here's Arielle and Jalan having this conversation, but as a participant, like, notice how it feels to know that our intention together here is to create a container for your listeners to receive feeling held in a transformational process. Like, that's extraordinary. So it transcends time and space in a way that someone's going to listen to this, and I know it's true, and you know it's true, and is going to have an emotional response. Or you're listening to this and you're going to have some part of your body that wakes up and responds to this conversation. And now you're being held in a fabric of community that allows you to turn toward that with tenderness and reminders that are being woven in of what happens if you turn to that with compassion. What happens if you turn to that with curiosity, right? What happens if you turn to it with creativity, right? Like you are the weaver. And, so wherever we can tap into what we'll call co-regulating spaces with other people who are also on a healing journey and can inspire us, and where we can feel held and less othered and less alone, and where we feel more of a sense of belonging, that's going to contribute to our own healing. And yes, therapy is great, and we do find those precious people. You don't let them go, because they're so important.
At what point did you feel safe enough to start healing, and what did that look like?
I think that healing happened in small increments along the way, and then there was some really significant tipping points. So I had my first therapist when I was like 8, but that was not a great experience because I spent most of my time hiding in the waiting room.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
I didn't feel safe yet to heal
Mm,
because the trauma was still happening.
mm,
Um, I had my second therapist, notable therapist, when I was 17, and I started to find some solace in someone else that just was able to see me without judgment. And that was huge. I had my third therapist when I started Naropa, my somatic psychology training here in Boulder, Colorado. And I just finished my yoga teacher training. I had just entered into a 3-year study of somatic psychology, and we were required to be in therapy, thank goodness. And I would end up on her couch and I would cry and cry and cry every session and not know why. And that happened for years where I just didn't know why I felt so much sadness and so much shame, but it was unwinding through me and I felt safe enough to let that happen. Um, and then I found, this was one of my bigger tipping points, I found the woman that's been my mentor for many, many, many years now. I met her in 2008. She wrote the foreword to the Posttraumatic Growth Guidebook. And I think I did the majority of my deepest integrative healing with her. Her name is Betty Cannon, wise soul that I almost feel like kind of helped put me back together.
mm. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So much of your work is rooted in the connection between the body and the mind. Um, how did you begin to weave these two together once you started healing in a way that would allow for others to experience that same healing?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier that like it was these experiences that I would have either on the yoga mat or in movement practices or in nature, and certainly in therapy. But most of them, when I had some opportunity to turn towards my felt sense in my body, that would ultimately help me feel more connected to myself as a whole. And it was so important, so instrumental. I often felt like I would go through, let's say, a yoga practice, and I would come out the other side feeling more at home in myself. And so, because that was so powerful for me, I just wanted to understand anything that I could about the body mind connection. So, I did a 3-year master's in somatic psychology, and it kind of gave me experientially a whole set of tools of how do we work somatically? What does that really look like? And it's slow and it's steady and it's incremental and it's going back to understanding the earliest pre-verbal developmental experiences that we had and how little bits of shock or disconnection or rejection get held within us, how those generational stories get transmitted through embodied learning. And then I wanted more, and I went back to school again, and I did a PhD in clinical psychology with the dissertation research on the mind-body connection and how do we bring mind-body therapies into clinical practice. And I think at that point, I started to learn more of the neuroscience behind the body-mind connection. And I got so hungry to understand everything that I could about that. Um, and then in 2012, I met for the first time Dr. Stephen Porges after I had been reading my way through his early papers for my dissertation work and, like fine tooth combing, trying to understand what is this polyvagal theory? What the heck is this? And I got to sit in a room with him for 6 hours and ask him all of my questions and be completely blown away by how it explained what I went through at that dinner table as a child when I felt like I was 15 feet behind myself and couldn't speak and my brain would go blank. And it also explained why movement and connecting to my breath and yoga helped me heal.
Mhm. I can't imagine what it was like to sit with Dr. Porges for 6 hours and have that hunger that you had and all those questions answered because um, I had an opportunity to interview him and, I had been studying his work, and it's one thing to read it and it's another thing to have him, explain it in his own words. And, after our interview, he sent me all these papers that he had been doing, and I'm reading them and I'm like, what? I don't understand. But, it was a great opportunity to sit with him and have him explain it in layman's terms, I'll say.
Yeah. And that really has been kind of my mission as well, is to really take a lot of the complicated nature of the polyvagal theory and the science and many other, kind of contributing scientific authors that help us understand this. I think about Antonio Damasio's work of the feeling of what happens, Alan Shore's work of right brain psychotherapy, Luz Cozolino, Dan Siegel. Like there's so many brilliant scientists. And I think a lot of the aim of my work has been to kind of create a bridge of, okay, great polyvagal theory, but why is that important to me? Right? How is
Yes.
that going to help me heal? And to translate it into, as you said, layman's terms, so that any one of us can read this and be like, oh, I get it. I get how
Mhm.
it's a reflection of me and my nervous system and my symptoms, but now I can look at them through that lens of physiology rather than self-blaming or, some idea that it's pathological. Like it's such a depathologizing perspective.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for sharing that. Um, a lot of people believe that healing is about just getting over trauma, but your work shows that it's about integration. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a misconception that somehow we're going to erase memories. Like, first of all, I'll just say that, right? Like I've had people that have come to me for EMDR therapy. I trained in EMDR in 2002. And, I've had people come in with this idea that somehow EMDR is going to make some part of them go away. And by all means, we can never do that for ourselves or for another person. It's kind of like telling a part of yourself that you're no longer welcome here. What's going to happen next? That part's going to get louder, right? And
Mhm.
it's going to rebel. And our psyches do not want to feel like they're being attacked or in any way being told that they're not welcome here. So what integration looks like is, how do I turn towards my own unique life experiences in a way that helps me create a meaningful life in relationship to it? It doesn't mean that I am going to say that everything happens for a reason or that it's all has some inherent meaning. It's much more about, how do I take that and take my power back in relationship to it, so that if indeed I went through some, really significant traumatic event and it feels like it's dragging me over the coals day after day with flashbacks um, and with somatic experiences every time I think about it or remember it, or with the urge to avoid anything that's possibly related to those memories, right? So we want to do, when we're reclaiming a sense of an empowered relationship to events of our past, is we want to be able to turn toward it and recognize that it's no longer happening, and it no longer has to keep taking us back into those symptoms as if it were still happening. That we can think about it, that we can feel ourselves here and now. We can choose what we want to believe about ourselves here and now in relationship to those events. And that we can also be at choice about when we think about it, so that I'm not necessarily reviewing my worst traumas when I'm trying to sleep at night or parent my kids or go to the gym or whatever it is that we want to do, go to work. So we have a greater sense of choice. We have a greater sense of empowerment about what we believe about ourselves in relationship to it. And it no longer has as much affective power or emotional power over us. We might still say it's objectively sad. It will always be objectively sad. But I know who I am. And that event and those beliefs doesn't have to define who I am anymore.
So let me ask you this, right? Let's say there's a listener who says, yeah, that's all fine and dandy, but, she's not living in extreme poverty, or, her parents weren't murdered by an outside government, or, any number of things. How do we connect with that listener and let them know that they have a voice and their story can be heard and that this does apply to them?
Right. It applies to all of us. And I'm going to take those two different examples separately for a moment. They're really potent examples.
Sure.
And the first being that when you are still living in extreme poverty, when you are still living in some kind of experience that has stripped you of your access to resources, the first layer to come in with is with understanding, with honoring the context within which you stand, with recognizing the real life here now limitations that you are up against and obstacles, and to know that those obstacles also don't define you, but they're also hella real. Like, that is so real. And you're like, I can't afford therapy. I can't afford to go to these things, right? Nonetheless, one of the tricky things about, let's go with poverty. Let's go with, some reduced access to resources that's ongoing throughout our lives, is that it can lead us to sometimes not see what is available. And therefore, we lose a sense of agency, or we have a fancy term called self-efficacy, but it's the belief that my actions will make a difference in the outcome of my day, my world, my life. And if life has basically kind of held us back with those external circumstances again and again and again, we lose that sense of self-agency or self-efficacy. So what I've explored in the research on resilience is that we need to start right there in recognizing that, hey, this podcast is free. I have a free YouTube channel of over 200 videos on trauma recovery. There are so many, and I'm just talking about you and I right now. There are so many people committed to handing, offering, holding open the door to top level trauma recovery resources. But if we have lost self-efficacy, we might not even walk through the door. We might not even press play. We might not recognize that that applies to us. And the truth is, and this is why I love the nervous system work, is that you can change the state of your nervous system, which also changes the state of your mind and your emotions, in 5 minutes, right? In 2 minutes, changing how you breathe, changing your posture, changing what you say to yourself, changing what you believe is possible in this day is going to change how you show up for yourself. It's going to change how you show up for your kids. It's going to change how you show up in the world in whatever way you're going to show up in the world. It's going to change your relationship to your current circumstances. It doesn't change the circumstances. But to know that you are still worth walking through the door to claim what is available out there, and there's a lot of it available out there. It's why I made as many of my books as possible purchasable for about $15, right? Somewhere between $15 and $25, right? Like, you can have a guided, workbook, the Complex PTSD workbook being the first one of those, that basically walks you through step by step in a healing process. It's not the same as one-on-one therapy, but it's something that's at your fingertips. Example number 2. When my trauma is so enormous, right? My parents were murdered by the cartel, right? Like, whatever it might be, right? Like, it can feel insurmountable. It doesn't have to be, right? There are other people who have been through unspeakable traumas that have also found a way forward. Find the people that help you feel less alone and that have modeled that there's a path forward. Find who resonates with your story. And if there's no one out there yet, know that you telling your story is going to resonate with someone else who's been through something similar. And therein, your story has meaning and purpose because it's going to change somebody else's life.
Thank you for sharing that. In your work, what's one of the biggest myths about trauma and healing that keeps people stuck that you found?
In regard to a myth, I mean, one of the kind of rather collective and unfortunately pervasive messages that we get is that somehow or another, vulnerability is a weakness. Right? We even see this, unfortunately, like, empathy is a problem, right? We can see this in current phenomenon in our news and world. And these messages have been passed on in small ways from father to son or parent to child. They've been passed on in larger collective societal ways. And I think that, one of the messages that I want to always promote is that vulnerability is strength. That willingness to feel and to be sensitive and to feel for yourself and to feel for others, it changes our world.
Thank you for sharing that. If there was one thing in particular that you would want to be known for or that would define your legacy, what would you want that to be?
This is where I should have reviewed the questions ahead of time. You got some good ones for me. What do I most want to be known for? That probably will change over time as I continue to evolve and grow. This year, 2025, I like the practice at the beginning of the year of choosing a word for the year. My word for this year was kindness. And that's a pretty good thing to be known for.
I agree. You reminded us that healing isn't just about erasing the past. It's about returning to ourselves with gentleness, with breath, and with truth. And you've shown that trauma may live in the body, but so does resilience, so does wisdom, and so does joy. For anyone who's listening, who's still in the dark, still holding their breath, what do you want them to know most?
Right. Well, certainly that there is a reason to keep on hanging on, right? Like if it's that dark, dark and light always coexist. And, if nothing else, everything has an impermanence to it, even if you feel like that tunnel is so long that there is no way that there is a light at the end of that one. But there really is. There always is. And maybe one of my favorite phrases is one that came from Mr. Rogers. Right, it's when went viral, I think, after the Boston Marathon bombing, and but it's been with me for quite a while. And it's that phrase of "There's always helpers." Look for the helpers. So if you are struggling, there are twice as many people out there to lend a hand as there are for those of us that are struggling. And so keep your eyes open because people want to. It doesn't matter. Like, come over and bring a meal or just sit and listen or, do your dishes for you. Like, whatever it is, there's someone out there that is willing to show up.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that a phrase that a lot of us are familiar with is post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. But something that you talk about often is post-traumatic growth, which I'll let you explain what that is and how it relates to PTSD, please.
Yes, my pleasure. My pleasure. So even if you, kind of start a Google search with post-traumatic, stress is the first thing that comes up. We've all heard of post-traumatic stress. And I'm maybe this goes back to your question about me, about my life mission. One of my life missions is to make post-traumatic growth a household word and as easily top of mind when we hear the words post-traumatic. And so what post-traumatic growth is the recognition that we can and often do develop within us the capacity to rise up stronger, to discover more of who we are, to find the inherent gifts and strengths and wisdom and courage that lives inside of each and every one of us when given the opportunities of enough access to resource and enough support. And that, I often liken this process to a hero or a heroine's journey, in the way that the trauma experiences of our lives, whether it's a single incident or the ongoing repeated traumas that happen over time, they will initiate that hero's journey. And it's a call to go down into, a sense, the underworld or the darkness or the cave we fear to enter, to confront that which is we're carrying in it within us, our fear, our shame, our grief, our pain, our rage, our terror, right? There's a lot that we carry in relationship to trauma. And when we can turn toward that in a way that is courageous, in a way that allows us to not have to do it alone, but have other people that are willing to turn towards that alongside us as our allies, that we can ultimately recognize that love is always going to override fear, that we are so much bigger than our pain, and that it is going to be vulnerable to confront that much terror or that much grief or that much, that much feeling of being so out of your control, right? But as we go into that underworld or those darkness, right, we come out with gifts. We come out with strengths that we didn't even know we had. I have a little checklist in my post-traumatic growth guidebook about how do we even know that we're growing after trauma, right? We see that there are people that are around us that we previously ignored, that were right there at the ready to be kind, right? We start to realize kind of new discoveries within us, or a spiritual passion. We discover that we want to tell our story and that people want to listen. We recognize that who we are is so needed in this world, right? And so all of these kind of signals of growth, if we don't know to look for them, and we only know to look for the signals of post-traumatic stress, that's all that we're going to see. So we want to broaden that capacity to see clearly where are those signs of growth.
That was beautiful. Thank you. All right, last question. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
So there's a lot of places to start. And I think that's, maybe in some ways a really generous response. Like I want to say, start where you are. Start with what feels like the next most accessible step, right? Whether that's, right, how am I going to make sure I stay hydrated today? How am I going to get out of bed and just walk around the block? How am I going to choose to listen to just one thing? Well, you're already doing that. You're listening to this podcast, right? Just one thing that inspires me today. Might I go on to Dr. Arielle's YouTube channel and watch just 5 minutes of one of her videos that inspires me today, right? Just like small things. Can I read 3 pages of that book on trauma recovery so that I can start to see that there's a path forward? And the more that I do those small things, they accumulate. And then that builds a sense of trust in yourself, your own commitment to showing up for yourself on the path of healing. And it becomes easier. And now you want to listen to the whole podcast, or you stay on for the 90 minutes of Arielle's class on YouTube, or you can come to my Zoom live class, right? Or you finish the workbook and you're ready for the next one. So there are so many ways, and start where you are. You're already on the path.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this. This has been a deeply healing and lovely conversation. Your energy, your wisdom, everything about what exudes from you is just healing. And I'm grateful to be able to share this space with you. I'm grateful for the work that you've done and the way you show up in the world now.
Thank you. Very mutual. I'm very grateful to be able to combine our very deep, heartfelt intentions together. I know there's going to be benefit out of that.
Thank you. If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
All right. Most of it's pretty straightforward and easy. If you look up just Dr. Arielle Schwartz on Facebook, on YouTube, on drarielleschwartz.com. You're going to find a lot of the resources that I have. I have a second website, resilienceinformedtherapy.com, resources for therapists integrating mind-body approach to healing. And I have 8 books out there on trauma recovery. So you'll find out about all of that on the websites. Instagram is Arielle Schwartz Boulder.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.